welcome to the Everyday Sublime podcast. I'm your host, Josh Summers, and it's a great honor to have your attention here. If you're listening over the audio version of the podcast, I just want you to know that we are going video. We have a video version of these shows that are being published now on YouTube and Spotify. So check out that. There's links for you in the show notes where you can find all that. Right now, I'd like to introduce you to my guest today. Her name is Kamala Masters, and Kamala is, in my opinion, one of the senior most first-generation insight meditation teachers in the United States and really the world, in that she is part of a small group of insight teachers that worked closely and directly with an Indian teacher named Munindra. And we'll get into this. Munindra was an incredibly influential yogi, a Dharma teacher who really has shaped the practice of insight meditation in the West. And Munindra was, as we'll get into in the conversation, one of the teachers, primary teachers of one of my main teachers, Jack Angler. So Kamala reminisces a bit about her time with Munindra. We also talk about her working with a Burmese teacher, a very strict Burmese teacher named Sayadaw U Pandita, who I worked with for a little while. And it's a real honor to have her voice here, to hear the years of experience and her deep experiential understanding of the Dharma come through in this conversation. So I hope you enjoy it, and let me know what you think in the show notes or send me an email. But I just want to encourage you, if you like this programming, if you like this conversation, do hit the subscribe button below. Subscribe to us on YouTube, subscribe to us in your favorite podcast player. And if you haven't picked up your copy of Everyday Vitality, 4 Ways to Feel Better Now, there's a link for you in the show notes for that. This is a free offering of 4 short 10 to 20 minute practices that my wife Terry and I share that really move your energy well, get your lymphatic fluid flowing, move your energy, and then we guide you through a calming yin yoga practice as well as a more energizing, dynamic flow yoga practice. So it's a way, sort of a sampler of our embodiment practices that we teach in our Sangha. There's a link for you in the show notes there, and I hope you enjoy those practices. But without further ado, here's today's guest, senior insight teacher, Kamala Masters. So today I'm with Kamala Masters. Kamala, thank you so much for returning to not the podcast, but to an interview with me. As I shared with the guests in the introduction, you were my very first interview about 5 years ago. So it's great to see you again. Welcome on.
Thank you. It's wonderful to be here, Josh. And I'm happy to connect with you again.
Yeah.
Right.
So I thought we could start, if I could just share a little bit of sort of the story that I'd say animates the spirit of this conversation, why I reached out to you. As you know, and as I think some of the listeners will know, a dear teacher, therapist, and mentor of mine named Jack Angler passed away this spring, I think in April. And there was a registry online where people could write remembrances of Jack. And the day after I wrote my remembrance, I got a notification that there was a new remembrance there. And it was from you and your husband, Steve Armstrong, writing about Jack. And it warmed my heart to read what you both wrote. And in the spirit of that, I wanted to invite you on to reflect a little bit about what you remember of Jack, and to branch into a sort of a shared dialogue of reflecting, remembering some of your spiritual ancestors, and as by way of some of my spiritual ancestors, and to try to convey to the audience, to people that may never have heard of these people, but to convey a sense of who these people were, their spirit, and I would say in some ways how they, particularly your teacher Munindra, was one of the central, seems like one of the central figures for leading the migration or the transmigration of insight meditation from the East to the West. So there's a lot that's sort of brewing within the spirit of what I would like to talk to you about. And as I shared with you before we started recording yesterday, about 20 years ago, I had really taken to the Dharma in a way. I had started going on silent meditation retreats at the Insight Meditation Society, where you've been teaching for many years. And circumstances worked out that I had some time after graduate school to go to Burma. It was recommended to me by a friend, while I have time, go to Burma and study with the masters there, whoever you can get in touch with there. And I feel very fortunate that I was able to meet and study with Sayadaw U Pandita, who I know is one of your teachers. I worked with him just for a short time, for a few months. And it was a very intense, as I'm sure you can imagine, it was a very intense experience. And on some level, I felt somewhat blissed out and delusionally equanimous during that retreat at some point. And when I came home, when I tried to come back to the United States, to Boston, and to pick up my life and to begin a career as an acupuncturist, I felt like I suddenly hit the pavement at 600 miles an hour, and psychologically I collapsed and started experiencing panic attacks like I had never encountered before. And through just a string of good luck and good fortune, I happened to find myself in Jack Engler's office. And when I called him to make the initial appointment, I told him about the retreat and told him what I was experiencing. And he said, "That sounds about right. I'm not surprised." And so that began my relationship with Jack, going to his office in Cambridge, seeing him every other week for almost 15 years, right up till the time he retired. And over that time, Jack would share story after story of his time with his teacher Munindra, Deepa Ma, working with Joseph. He would mention you from time to time. And it was, in a way, Jack really became a spiritual father to me. And listening to him share about his work in India with Munindra and Deepa Ma, and knowing that you had worked similarly with Munindra, I wanted to maybe start with just asking you, how did you come to meet Munindra? How did you find the Dharma and Munindra? I know that's a big question. And then from there, what was your relationship with him like, and what was studying with him like? I'm really interested in hearing that from you to start.
Yeah, thank you for that. And we connect a lot. Jack and I connected a lot because we both had that teacher. There's a name for it in Pali that I can't remember now, but I'll tell you in a bit when it comes up. So how I met Munindra-ji is that I had heard about him when I started practicing the Dharma in San Jose at a long time ago, about 1975 or 76, probably more like 75. And how I got there was that I was really going through a lot of difficulty in my life. I became a single mother all of a sudden with 3 children. I arrived from having gone to have my children in the Philippines, where I was born, raised in America, went back to the Philippines. And when I came back, I had these 3 children and was a single parent. It was a very difficult time. And I remember once when I was on Highway 1 coming down to where I lived in Santa Cruz, California, a little place called Aptos. There was a sign on the road that said, spiritual fare. And so it was at the University of California at Santa Cruz. So I took my car in there and I had my 3 children with me. And I went into this huge gymnasium where all these people were there. They were playing drums and the smell of incense and um, a lot of those things those were still the hippie days were still going on. And I walked in, it was very confusing for me. I had really just come from the Philippines, had a very different life after I had left my first year of college and moved back to the Philippines where I was born. Anyway, there was one sign at the very end on the right-hand side that said silent retreat. I ignored everything else and I went towards that with my children just pulling at my, my skirt and everything and saying, Mommy, Mommy this, Mommy that. They were 6 and under. And I signed up for a 3-day retreat and a weekend retreat. And I was able to go to that. I have relatives, and being of Filipino origin, the clan helps one another. So I could leave to do that. So then during that time, to make a long story short, I learned about Munindra-ji, that he would be coming and that he was this wonderful teacher. And I signed up out of nowhere. I just signed up. I think I took that retreat and then I signed on for a 1-month retreat. Like, whoa, what is that? So, but I do have to say that because the retreat was in San Jose, I was able to go home once in a while and check on my children that my family were taking care of. So it was very strong in me when I just heard about him and I thought, this is it. I have to go. There's no two ways about it. And so there was something, maybe past life thing. So I went to that, and that's how I met him. And it started a lifelong connection with him where he became like a Dharma father to me.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's how it started. From then on, I attended retreats that were led by him. Actually, when he came to America, that was when he was going from the West Coast to see Joseph and IMS on the East Coast. So there's immediate connection to that. And went to some retreats with him. And when I moved to Hawaii 3 years after that, or 2 years after that, I started asking him to come here because I couldn't go to where he was. And I arranged retreats for him and got to sit them, and he came to stay in our household before and after. So I got to know him on a very household level. And I heard stories like I would Joseph hear, and stories about Munindra and Deepama and his teaching of her. And so she became my bright faith, that if this woman as a householder could do it, then I could do this too. And Munindra, he didn't talk about to just quiet the mind and have those blissful states. He talked about that the path ends at Nibbana, at the the path to the end of suffering goes in that direction. And so that's what he teaches. And then the teachers I would connect with would include the full understanding of the liberation teachings.
And that was part. Thank you for that. That was part of the spirit. What you just said, that he taught the path to nibbana as the end of suffering, and that was part of the spirit that I think I really connected with Jack Engler around. Was that I don't know how publicly Jack would say this, but I got the sense that Jack had a concern that as the Dharma was migrating west, that Nibbana was maybe the baby that was getting thrown out with the bathwater, that there was less emphasis on awakening, less emphasis on Nibbana, probably because it it can instill a quite a striving mentality, and so I just appreciate that emphasis that has come through.
Yeah.
But I got the sense from Jack that Munindra was an idiosyncratic, I don't know if that's the right word, but an interesting character, in a sense that he wasn't a monastic, but he wasn't like a normal lay person, as I understand it. Can you describe
Yeah.
what his role, or what kind of position he had in terms of becoming a teacher?
Well, he was a monk in the Mahasi tradition. He went from India to Burma to actually practice with Mahasi Sayadaw, and he became a monk for 5 years. But he gave up those robes because he wanted to experience a different part of life, not to be sequestered from lay people, because he was so connected to a lot of lay people, to the Baruas, for example. Deepa Barua, her last name. And he wanted to be able to connect with them. And so there are a lot of restrictions, being a monk. So he took 10, the 10 precepts, and that was a lot more, gave him a lot more experience in connecting with lay people. So he didn't have that. How many is it? 237 rules in the Vinaya. And
Yeah,
yeah,
and so with his emphasis on, particularly what he communicated to Deepa Ma, and I'm sure countless others, that nibbana, full liberation, was a very real potential for anybody.
right.
And whenever I would challenge that, bring that up to Jack and challenge him about that, like, well, no, I need to go on a longer retreat. He would often quote Munindra and say something like, that he would say, Munindra used to say, either your practice is all of your life or it's none of your life.
Oh,
And I don't know if you ever heard that line, but to me, it and Jack gave stories about how Munindra had this kind of almost rapacious interest and curiosity in everything, that he took tremendous interest in just understanding and getting to know his students. He was interested in all sorts of topics. He practiced yoga. He encouraged his students to go study with other different teachers that may be in contrast with his teaching. But there was this great, if cosmopolitanism is the word, but there was a great interest in all sorts of things, and nothing, it seemed, was excluded from his
right.
seeing it as part of the Dharma.
So that had some connection with Mahasi Sayadaw, even though Mahasi Sayadaw was a monastic person and very, very monastic, and guided a lot of monastics. He was one of the first people to publicly bring the practice to lay people. And remember that Munindra was in his monastery at that time, in his retreat place, the Yeka in Burma,
Can I
at that
just
time.
can I give this? I've just
Yeah,
heard for the listeners to get opened up. I actually feel like I was able to do a pilgrimage to that center you're mentioning now,
right.
and it's hard for someone who hasn't been there to imagine what this looks like. But I remember an older friend of mine taking me on a tour there, and there were these enormous pavilions where it seemed like there was a campus of maybe 15 or more of these enormous pavilions that
Yeah,
in each pavilion could host or hold maybe 200, 300, 400 meditators. And it seemed like,
that's right.
it was a ghost town when I was there. There was hardly anybody there, but my guest, actually, my tour guide said, that was the kuti, or that was the room that Steve Armstrong used to practice in, or had,
Yes,
he
yeah,
was aware of that.
right.
But
Yeah,
it just felt like a hive of practice and a
right.
hive of awakening. So
Yeah.
when you mentioned it, I just wanted to try to get that
Thank
feel.
you. Yeah, thank you for making that connection, because Steve often tells a story of when he was there, how he would hear people chanting in the morning from this pavilion, that pavilion. One of them could hold like 1,000 sometimes, and you would hear them chanting the precepts or the Metta Sutta, the Metta chant. And so just making that connection, that remember that I'm making it just now as you have said this, that he was at that Mahasi Sayadaw or meditation place. And Mahasi Sayadaw wanted to bring the teachings of the liberation teachings of the Buddha to the lay people. And for the most part, they were only for monastics, so that they could practice the concentration for a long time and then go on, shift to Vipassana and learn the suttas and the Abhidhamma and Pali and everything. And but even Mahasi Sayadaw taught to his relatives. I think I got that right, and maybe friends in his township, and saw that they could catch on to how it is, just like Munindra taught the lay people in Deepening and those friends, and they could actually liberate their minds from greed, hatred, and delusion in stages. And so I think this is what might have inspired Munindra, now that you're talking about it, because he came from that group of monks and that area, that it was acres or hectares, of land. And so many people came to practice there. And so Munindra maybe got the bug, I maybe assuming that this happened. So he decided to teach to more lay people than to be a monastic.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was the big thing. So then when he brought it to the West, yes, he was a pioneer in doing that. And Joseph and Jack were too. So that connection was made. And then the opening to lay people just spread out to the West. It had already begun in some way in Europe, but that was mostly with monastics, by the way, some of the monks. But now it's more opening to lay people. And it just exploded, right, when it came here.
Yeah,
So
and I
go ahead.
also recall that, just to reflect back what you're saying. So Munindra was a student of this sort of
Great master.
shaker mover monk Mahasi Sayadaw,
Right.
who, from what I understand, was part of a movement, a revival movement to teach meditation to lay practitioners. That was part of in a way, a form of social resistance to British colonial occupation. That
Mhm.
there's a book called The Birth of Insight that sort of looks into this, but that sort of monastic leaders were fearful that with colonialism, the British rule, that that Buddhism would be eradicated from Burma. And is this your understanding, that there was this movement, this groundswell of sort of grassroots teaching to lay practitioners to keep the Dharma alive, as it were?
Oh, I really never heard that, but it sounds like it makes sense.
Yeah,
Yes.
there's
Yeah.
I remember an article about it, I think in Tricycle, and there's a book called The Birth of Insight that gets into it. But it's the reason I'm mentioning that is because it's a sort of a historical twist, in that if British colonialism was one of the contributing conditions that led to this movement of teaching lay people meditation
Mm,
practice, both U Ba Khin and
right.
Mahasi Sayadaw. It's Mahasi's method through a student like Munindra that the practice has come to the West, and probably, I would say, seeded what we now think of as the mindfulness movement.
Right. That's true. Yeah. So, yeah, I want to know about that more, but I'll read up on that and we can talk about that part later. But that's how Munindra, that was his shift. It was during that time period that he shifted to be a 10 preceptor and an Anagarika who wears the white robes,
Mhm.
you know. And so they still have certain rules. I don't think he held money. Anyway, I'm not sure about all of that, but that's not
Mhm.
so germane to what we're talking about.
Something that's of interest to me is having practiced with U Pandita, Sayadaw U Pandita in Burma, and seeing that form of practice. I know I would describe it as a very strict, some a contemporary word might be hardcore form of the practice. There's not a lot of wiggle room. The technique's extremely clear. The way you're
Yeah.
meant to report is extremely clear. The schedule is extremely clear. And I juxtapose that experience I had in the Mahasi system with remembrances I remember from Jack around working with Munindra, where it sounded like students would go to Munindra's house in Bodh Gaya and kind of, I don't know if there was chai or a little bit of food, but they'd sit around and sort of talk and get into Dharma discussions that could go on for hours and hours and hours. And,
Right. Right.
he seemed to have this rhapsodic ability to just let like a fountain of Dharma, it would just come out of him.
That's
This is the way Jack kind of presented it. And I was wondering if was being on retreat with him like that, or did you have that similar type of an encounter of just?
He was different on retreat. Yeah, he was different. Munindra-ji was different on retreat. He was not strict. Like he kept saying, keep it simple and easy. We hear that from Joseph too. Simple and easy, was what Munindra would always say. But it wasn't like held in a feeling of strictness because he wasn't a monastic,
Mhm.
and he didn't wear the robes, and the robed ones, they're more formal. So, this, what you just said a minute ago about his strictness. Now, an Asian person wouldn't think that. Yeah, but it's because, Westerners are just more free to kind of do it their own way or take some liberties here and there. But when you actually do it the way that U Pandita knew how to offer that, because he is from Burma and he is Asian, then when he would teach to the Asian people, they would follow the instructions and okay, this is the way it goes. So there was a different attitude. So
Mhm.
you might not think in Asia that was strict. You would just take it as this is how the teaching goes. Yeah.
Yeah, no, for
Uh,
sure. There was a bit of a rude awakening for me. Um,
yeah.
it's the only way I can describe it. It was just like
Yeah.
it's almost hitting a wall. Just
Yes. Yeah.
oh, there's no wiggle room here at all.
Yeah. Right.
And I saw the 10,001 ways that my mind was fighting and resisting and arguing and and feeling terrible about everything, until there was sort of a shift within the practice, I'd say.
Yeah.
Um, did you want
Yeah.
to say?
So, okay.
No, I didn't know if you had a thought to finish.
Yeah, yeah, more about that in that. So I was so happy to have Munindra before I practiced with U Pandita, because it could be, see, I was born in the Philippines but raised in California. So I had both, I had both kind of mindsets. But when Munindra was so easy with it, like the thing probably you heard too, that if you ask Munindra one question, he would keep answering it and keep making connections until the last person in the room left, kind of, that thing. So he was very well studied in all the scriptures and everything. So he was so interested in how people were interested, and he would connect. So I had so much compassion from Munindra-ji that when I went to practice with, I think I had more of an inner balance of knowing how to handle that. And I'm part Asian too, so it
Mhm.
made it easier for me to handle that kind of direct strictness. Yeah.
Yeah, that's good. Very interesting to hear. Um, in terms of how he taught, in term like listeners might not know this, but the Mahasi method that you're referring to, you can tell me if you feel like this is a fair characterization or not. My experience with it, it's a very specific, stylized form of practice. There's specific technique, there's specific methodology of how to apply the technique, and it's simple, but it's incredibly powerful in terms of how it trains and develops perception and awareness. And I was just wondering, did he emphasize, say, the features of noting? Did Munindra emphasize noting and the slowness of movement in the same way that?
Both of those, yeah. He taught with the noting in the teaching, and also the walking, the slow walking. He showed us how to go more slowly, more and more slowly, and so all of that in a retreat. To answer that question more thoroughly, in a retreat, it was very different. We paid attention to the schedule. There was a lot of silence. You only met with him like for 15 minutes to get a review of your practice and more guidance. And so he, when he gave a Dharma talk, it was just that 1 hour. He didn't go on and on. So he went with the schedule, and he didn't hold it so strictly, but the whole schedule held everybody, because I organized some of those retreats. And so you felt the incredible respect for the Dhamma. That's what you felt. And because he had that, so you felt that the way he would bow, and then that's how we would bow to him. And so it wasn't formal. It just, you felt like it came from his heart. So when I first went to practice with U Pandita, I had all of that. I had a softening around the Dharma, and I could see it in another way, but I did follow his. People ask me, what was the main thing that you did that helped you in your practice? And all I can say is I really just followed instructions.
Yeah.
I really I came in with a lot of faith, and I really just said, okay, I'll do that. And then as things unfolded and the practice, and I look back, I could see, I understand why it was that way. Why you do it this way. Why is it on the abdomen instead of at the nostrils? Although Munindra taught both. He gave a choice. And what happens, why it unfolds in a certain way very organically, is because at each step, it's an unfolding to one of the major universal characteristics. But the yogi doesn't even know that. It's just naturally unfolding that way. So I'm not going to go through that now, because that has to do with the progress of insight. But when you see how the unfoldment takes place, both Munindra and actually U Pandita never talked about the progress of insight. It was only later, if one of the teachers thought that you need to understand what you just went through, they let you read it. But it kind of was a mistake for people to read it in the West beforehand. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, and
so,
that actually loops back to our first interview, or my interview with you 5 or so years ago. You and Steve had, I think, published a translation and commentary of the Progress of Insight, Mahasi's Progress of Insight. And again, we don't have to get into it too deeply here, but it is, just for listeners to have a reference for it, is it 16 stages of insight? Is it 16?
Yeah, something like that.
That a meditator, basically, as a meditator progresses, they move through these knowledges, or jnanas, insights about the nature of reality, insights about the nature of experience. You mentioned the 3 characteristics of impermanence, suffering, non-self, being, I'd say, understood at deeper and deeper, more refined levels.
Experientially,
right. And yeah, I can confess, like you said, it's probably a mistake if it falls into Western hands, and that model did fall into my hands, and it did bring about a lot of grasping, striving, comparing, frustration that I haven't had the thing that was supposed to happen, when the teacher said, "Oh, it's in the vicinity of it happening." It brought a lot of frustration, and I kind of had to step away from it. I think for the better, but that doesn't mean my practice isn't just. I haven't continued to do the practice, and I was wondering if you could speak to that, the broad development of insight,
Okay.
without necessarily getting into the minutiae or the details
Yeah.
of it, but just what is deepening? Like, if
Yeah.
someone wasn't familiar with what this path was, how would you describe what is deepening in the course of sustaining the practice in this particular way?
Well, the first thing that begins to deepen, and in a broad sense, I'm going to make it broader than just the practice. Actually, that the sitting practice or the silent retreat practice. Um, there are general steps one needs to take even in one's life for this all to unfold in a very natural way. And the first step is to practice generosity. So generosity is one of the 3 pillars of the Dharma, and this teaching from Munindra-ji. And why? Because every time we practice giving something, giving of our time, our energy, or something that belongs to us or our resources, we're letting go. It's a natural, just opening the hand and letting go of. In the long run, it's greed, hatred, and delusion. And when you let go, in generosity, the first part of letting go or loosening attachment is really powerful to continue that practice. And the second practice is the practice in Sila. Sila is non-harming. So it's not harming. It's kind of the opposite. One is about attachment. The other one is not harming or not hurting people. That comes a lot with aversion and mixed with attachment of how we want it to be, etc. And so when we practice Sila that means non-harming with speech and behavior. When we're fairly practiced at that, even as just being a good human being, people who have that kind of instilled in their own life have an easier time unfolding in the practice. And so
Yeah,
so those two, the last thing is the bhavana, the mind,
sure.
Development of the mind.
Question that just came to me is, did you have, this may be a strange question, but did you have a religion? This is a question that Sayadaw U Pandita asked me at one point. But did you have a religion that you were a part of before coming to Buddhism?
I did. And before and even at the time, I was raised as a Catholic.
So, culturally, historically, I think this is interesting in that Jack Engler was also a Catholic, raised a Catholic.
I know.
There aren't that many Catholics in the Western Buddhist. It's a lot of Jewish teachers. And the reason I'm mentioning that is because I was raised agnostic, a kind of secular agnosticism. And I really had some hard time connecting and relating and understanding the emphasis, when I got to Asia, the emphasis on generosity in the way that was expressed, and Sila, it felt moralizing. It felt like it was maybe performative, but I can see it in myself that it was a formation that I lacked. Right. And I think what I'm getting at is, I didn't have that formation of cultivating generosity for much of my life, or cultivating Sila, sort of ethical precepts of non-harming. I just could have tried to jump in and do the bhavana meditation cultivation part.
Okay.
And it brings this teaching that I remember, I'm sure you've heard it from Jack, from Munindra, that Jack would share, that practicing without Sila is like trying to row a boat without untying it from the dock.
I know.
Do you know that one?
Exactly true. Yes, it's true. It feels like that. But But some of us, and I sense that you have innate goodness.
I would like to think I have innate goodness too. I think I struggle with, um, you know, I feel like I feel always I'm falling short on how good my potential could be in a certain sense.
Oh,
Because I've just seen examples of practitioners and people that really do feel like they have this immense selfless generosity as the
mm.
default of their character, and I take it I'm just not far enough along the path
Oh,
to connect with that yet, but I admire it and aspire to it. But I would say I still struggle. Um,
uh,
but so what I'm trying to encourage you to maybe explore is that the really important role that generosity and Sila have for the development of insight
right.
as a foundation. Because I guess I feel like I've been doing a lot of hours of rowing with the boat still tied to the dock.
Well, I don't know. It seems like a little bit that you told me about your practice. You can still go far. Anyway, yes, it is so important that um, I mean, we here at the sanctuary that I have here, we chant it every morning. It's so important to remember to not harm, and that's a generosity too,
Mhm.
because it gives people safety. So remembering that, so it takes practice to really like take a look at the paramis, and generosity is the first one. The paramis are the beautiful qualities of mind that we develop in order to walk the path, and then they are developed even more deeply when we're on the path, when we're practicing. So, a little story about Munindra. Um, I remember when I just met him, and he said, why are you on a spiritual path? Um, can't remember exactly how he asked, but something like that. And I said, because I've always wanted to know God, to see God, but I don't know what that is. And he said, is your heart pure? And I said, no. I could say that right away. And he said he had studied the Bible or parts of the Bible, and he read this piece about um, um, let's see, where does it come from now?
My
It's,
biblical knowledge is very, very
yeah,
limited.
it's something about if you have a purity of heart, those who are pure in heart will see God.
Mhm.
And that's why he said, do it. And I said, well, how do I do that? And then he talked to me about generosity and about Sila, and to really pay attention to that, because that would really help me in my practice. So generally, I'm a pretty good, I have some innate kind of goodness, or kind of know what leads to suffering, and, but still have some habit patterns. Anyway, he, I really got that. And so I really started to look at the paramis more, the 10 paramis. So
And
that's one thing people can do to practice. And sometimes we as teachers, when we see people come in with that kind of purity of heart, we just say, oh, that one might be easy. It's that, you know, might be
being easy for that person,
for the practice, to go through the practice, yeah, go through the stages. Yeah.
because
But
it's easier for them to go through the stages because of the sort of the
the
purity,
paramis,
the
the
paramis that
purity
they've
of
called.
their
Yeah,
heart.
yeah,
Yeah. Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart,
yeah.
for they shall see God." That was it. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah.
So, yeah, those two things are really important in the practice. And so, even though I feel that there has been, some sense that some of those defilements have been attenuated or calmed down, and some, uprooted a bit, that I still feel, I have work to do in working in the paramis. Yeah.
Yeah, and that reminds me of, I think, one of my first conversations with Jack when I showed up in his psychotherapy office. Um, I'll paraphrase. I think I said something like, I don't understand. I've just done, I ticked off all the retreats I've just done. I'm like, I've put all this time into practice, trying to purify my heart. And I feel like I'm becoming more aware of my shortcomings, my vulnerabilities, my personal
Mm.
problems, my psychological problems. I'm more
Oh.
aware of it than I was. And he quoted another teacher, a Zen teacher, around something to the effect that um, people often think with enlightenment, the personal problems go away. And the Zen teacher had said, actually, with enlightenment, with awakening, now you have the light to see and deal with your personal problems. And I definitely feel like this is a bedrock truth from my experience in practice. And for example, on any long retreat I've done, part of what makes it difficult is having memory of unskillful karma, harm that I've done to myself or to someone else through speech, usually,
Mm.
just in conflict, and have that come back and being in the silence of sitting with it, just an exquisite remorse or regret that would come. And so
Yeah.
that this is part of the heart, the pain of insight practice, in a sense that I think
Yes.
a real kind of compassion can grow from when it's understood. But I'd love to hear if, like, a lot of
Mhm.
people think, well, people go to meditate and they're going to sit in quiet and their minds will quiet down and they'll get into peace states, and then they'll be able just to go back into their daily life and maintain a calm clarity or a calm peacefulness. And it just doesn't seem to go that way. It's sort of, people know that when you go on a long retreat, there's going to be massive things that come
Yeah.
up. And so this gets to Jack Engler's kind of famous axiom that you have to become somebody to become nobody, or there's a development
Right.
of becoming a healthy somebody as you become a healthy nobody. And I would love to hear from you, either from your own practice or um, from working with students for so many years.
Yeah.
What do you see in this kind of development that I'm just trying to describe?
Mhm. Well, I know people come to the practice because thinking they're going to get all peaceful and calm, and then that's what they're going to take home. But in actuality, as you just described, and I have also experienced, what happens in the course of being more and more aware is that it shines a light upon everything that has been hidden for a long, long time, and in delusion, of not seeing clearly or not seeing it at all. Delusion is seeing, but not seeing clearly. And ignorance is just ignoring it. So there's both. And so in mindfulness practice, we have the opportunity to start knowing what all that is, the layers of hidden habit patterns that become known. Along the way, though, if we keep doing the practice, what the mind starts taking in is more and more what is called right view or wise view, to see that everything that arises is so ephemeral and so passing away, and also doesn't have a core. What is this self that? No, it's not even there. And all this stuff that's coming up and passing away. Um, we Including that memory that we had, is so coreless and uncontrollable too, that anatta characteristic starts getting seeped in the mind. Oh, not this is happening, but not identified with it. This is happening, but not identified with it. So you kind of have to get used to seeing that. And sometimes we need people like Jack along the way. Like I've had therapists too, along the way to help me through certain areas, because you have to have a healthy sense of oneself before you can go into no self, before you can really open totally to the understanding of no self. So it's more like, if I want to add something to that, maybe this even comes from Jack, is that you have to have a healthy sense of self, you know, and to kind of it's in the Dharma, I've heard it described as, in psychotherapy, it's like you kind of understand all the furniture in the room, and you start moving some away, or maybe letting go of some of the furniture, and you move it around. But in the Dharma, all the furniture empties out, and you start with a clear, pure mind. You restart. So I just want to say something that I said to you last time, that even arahants, even fully enlightened beings, they say, it's a saying in Burma, even when the bottle's empty, there's still a smell. Like they still have their personality, and but there's no harm being done and no karma being made. Yeah.
Yeah. There's a question I have around, one question that comes up a lot in Buddhist conversation around the teaching of non-self, which I think trips people up. I think sometimes people interpret it that the Buddha was saying there's no self. And I've heard teachers, scholars debate, say, no, he's saying what is not. He's just simply saying, pointing to what is not a permanent, unchanging self. And you've talked about seeing the three characteristics, the relentless changing nature of all phenomena. I think Munindra's line was just empty phenomena rolling on.
Rolling on.
But whether it's a sensation, whether it's a thought, whether it's a feeling, there's, and this Mahasi practice that you've done, that I've done a little bit of, that's the closest that I've seen to just at a microscopic level,
right,
where every part of experience is resolved to a granular display of just coming and going, and going,
right,
blipping in, blipping out, blipping in, and so the question that I've heard is, when a meditator is aware of all experience coming and going with relentless change or relentless impermanence, what is it that is aware of that relentless change? So the observing of do you see where I'm going? The observing of the non-self characteristic, what's doing that? How did, and I know that can sound like an intellectual question, but it becomes this sort of mystery that I feel like I'm still this question that I'm holding in my heart. And I just, as someone who's practiced as much as you have and has taught as long as you have, I'd be curious to have your reflections on that.
Well, so how do I shortcut that answer? Is when we're in practice, what we begin to see is every one of the five aggregates, the five aggregates of bodily experience, and then there's four of them of the mind: pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, Vedana, and then there's perception, and then there's consciousness, and then there's intention. And what happens, and there's those break down to even more, but what happens is, in moment to moment, awareness begins to see, and wisdom begins to grow. And those two are separate things, awareness and wisdom. Wisdom begins to grow and to understand that everything that is coming up within the five, what makes up this body-mind experience, which is it's broken down to these five aggregates. Every one of those that come up in various moments, awareness begins to see that each one is either ephemeral and with no core, and the uncontrollability of it, which is the anatta aspect, or it sees the impermanent aspect, that everything just disappears and it's seen one by one by one. It's not just some concept in your head that everything's impermanent. It's actually seeing it on that moment to moment level. And then, or sees the dukkha nature of it, which you see that there's absolutely nothing in what makes up these five aggregates that's you can hold on to. It's all it's unsatisfactory. So in time, the mind develops this kind of dispassion for all of that and stops holding on, really just lets go. So we start to see that with every single thing, that what makes up this body-mind continuum. And wisdom starts to grow in the mind and starts to get more and more disidentified, or not so clinging to a sense of self around any one of those things. At the same time, what's really important is to understand that that's on the absolute level. The mind is seeing on the absolute level, moment by moment by moment. But on the relative level, there does exist a sense of self. And that sense of self operates in the world with, Sila and the paramis and wisdom. And so they both exist. And so understanding not self, or the anatta characteristic, does not wipe out that sense of self in the world. What happens with that sense of self in the world is one becomes more genuinely kind and generous and all those things that make up a good human being. So that there's both. And that's why we need both compassion, because it's for our worldly life. And we need to have the wisdom that knows the absolute level too. So the thing is that those two are side by side, given respect. And on the relative level, it has to do with really being aware of karma, the cause and effect relationship between everything, so that when we truly deeply understand that, then we can't harm. It's accidental if we do, etc. So just remembering this phrase from Padmasambhava, though my mind is as expansive as a sky, my attention to the cause and effect relationship of life, or karma, is paid equal attention to. So that's relative and absolute together.
Yeah.
So they're not separate. So your first question is what is being aware? Awareness is being aware. I mean, that sounds like I'm trying to evade the question, but there's not a self in there that made up of one or two or five of these aggregates that are so concrete that, okay, that's the self. That when we believe that, that's like wrong view. So in the practice, the mind starts breaking up into these pieces of knowing one of those aggregates and the awareness of it moment by moment, another aggregate or one of the six sense doors and the awareness of it moment by moment. So even in that very first phase, this conglomeration, or this kind of concretizing of a sense of self, starts to break up. You don't even know it. But as you went through your practice, it started to break up more and more and more. And then when it gets to like, oh, it's so scary losing a sense of self, yeah, a person can go off the rails there. That's true.
Well, that brings me to my story at the beginning of, coming home from Burma and finding myself in Jack's office. And before I left Sayadaw U Pandita in my final interview, he asked if, what my plans were. And I said, I need to go home. And I had student loans kicking in for my graduate school. And he just said it would be better if you'd stayed, or better if you could stay. And he actually said, you're closer to your destination if you stayed. And I could see that, like, if I just stayed here for longer, like there was a way I could see how the practice was going to continue. I could feel it developing, and I felt like I was in a momentum with it, and I could see the wisdom of not interrupting that momentum. He compared it to like putting the car in the garage and not turning it on for too long. If I go back off your track. And so when I shared that with you, we spoke briefly yesterday. You had said the same thing. Like it would have been better if you had stayed. And
Oh, word for word, I think.
yeah, so you're right in line with Sayadaw U Pandita on that. And I guess this is, I've had a sense of I didn't get to finish the job, like in the sense like I didn't get to go all the way yet. I don't claim any significant awakening other than just the
Yeah.
struggles I have with being who I am. But as a teacher, you know, do you see that too? That the people maybe that their process gets interrupted, or do you
Oh,
encourage people to
yeah.
stay in retreat if you sense that they're
I have.
opening
Yeah.
to non-self in this way?
Yeah, I have. Or, the um, request or admonition is you next time take a longer time, and then I really see people um, develop more. And just want, like I always tell everyone, what the pathway that the wisdom part of your mind has made in your mind body continuum, that is still there. That pathway and the opening that you made in your practice is still there. So your mind would be able to open to that again. So you're not, but it would be good for you to go and do a longer retreat.
Yeah, I have
Yeah,
to get my
yeah,
affairs in order again. I had a
yeah,
special window where I had enough time before student loans kicked in that I could take some of that time, but
yeah.
I have to orchestrate it again. Um, you're speaking about non-self and the insight of that, and the question that came up in my mind as you're speaking is, if I can frame it, um, I'm curious about how you would speak to the relationship between the deep experiential insight of emptiness or anatta and a conversion of being that brings the transient self that experiences anatta this way and transforms them into a being in the world that is aligned with non-harming and non-suffering.
Mm,
And I'm asking because of the meta crises across the globe that we're seeing, whether it's at the level of climate change,
yeah,
tribalism, international warfare, uh,
yeah,
the racialization of people's hearts, and just the inflammation, the fires that are on. I think of
mm,
the Buddha's fire sermon, but if you just turn open the news or look at the paper,
yeah.
there's just fires, literally fires, but fires of the heart almost everywhere you look.
Mm,
And you've spoken to it a little bit, but I know there are people that are listening that would want to hear something like
yeah,
how you connect the internal transformation that occurs through this deep kind of practice you're describing
mm.
and a different ethical in the world sensibility that, in my view, is required if our species is going to survive.
Yes, yeah. The way that it comes just very quickly, easily to me is compassion. And this is a time when we need to have a lot more of that compassion that firstly can open to the dukkha without striking out at it or without saying, this is the way I think it's holding tightly to our own views and opinions, but the kind of um, compassion that opens to suffering. So that's the definition of compassion is to be the ability to open to suffering. And then it's not complete unless we take steps to relieve the suffering in ourselves, if that's what's needed, the first step that's needed, and in the world. So this is a time where a lot of compassion needs to be experienced, um, and compassionate action. So, like I've been talking about it a lot in my teachings, and um, offering the compassion practice so we get used to opening to suffering. One of the things that I see a lot is people have all their attention out there about what's going on out there and the suffering about that, and just kind of burning up in it. But there's not a whole lot of encouragement to go here first, to turn the attention of compassion to our own hearts. And so that's where a lot of the fire starts in the world. And then we feed it by not understanding where we're coming from, or not letting our hearts settle ourselves. So compassion practice is really important now. And the Dalai Lama teaches so much about compassion. That's what's missing right now. There's more emphasis on compassion. Even though, I'm a person of color, and I was raised that way, even though I'm half white, I wasn't raised in that by my father at all. I never really met him very much. So I just see that no matter how much I try sometimes, to be the best I can be in that world of racial discrimination, and understanding that there's so much kind of that it has to go towards understanding in that direction now. So I understand that there's so much coming up from the past, that we have to open our compassion to the suffering that people are bringing out into the world, of how much like it's happened in the US. So, but then because of that suffering, you don't feel that compassion back because people are suffering. And so we have to hold a lot these days, and it's compassion fatigue.
Mm.
So anyway, there's a lot more to that, but I just feel that sometimes my own efforts are like I'm not doing enough, when I'm so tired out at the end of the day of trying to do, connect with all the things that I don't think that's really true. But yeah, there's just needs to be more compassion to all the confusion that's going on right now.
I think compassion fatigue, the phrase I've heard recently is climate grief. And I know I was thinking of you in August when the fires in Maui were raging, and I hope you guys are okay where you were.
Yeah.
But a lot of these fires, literal and metaphorical, are, as a friend reminded me, they do affect the most disadvantaged, or the underprivileged populations very acutely. And I feel a sense of, I feel my heart is awakened through the practice. I have traveled enough. I have friends and all scattered throughout the world, and I care, and I feel a kind of a singular inadequacy in terms of what any one person can do. But I don't want to use that as an excuse to not to do anything, in a way too. And so I align with, I teach and share practices of yoga and meditation, and as I see as a karmic act of trying to put a different kind of energy / ripple of consciousness into the collective space on a very small scale. And I guess I'm just responding back to you that this is, every teacher I've spoken to really feels that to use Jack's phrase, transformation of consciousness, that the way you spoke to how the practice uproots greed, hatred, and delusion, and that's the other side of compassion, in a way, right?
Yes.
When the heart sees more clearly, I guess this is where I'm meandering a little bit. I apologize for my meandering here, but
it's okay.
How does compassion arise? That's
Oh,
I think
yeah,
I'm coming. I think that's what
yeah.
I was at the heart of my question.
Mhm.
How do you
The
see compassion arising?
Yeah, the proximate cause for compassion to arise is suffering. And so it requires us to actually turn our minds towards what's happening. And we can't help it so much these days because of the quickness of the news and the ubiquitous of so many newsy places. So turning our minds directly to that and seeing what action we can take. So the proximate cause for compassion to arise is turning the mind towards suffering. And so, but the question I keep asking is, are we turning it towards here?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that there's so much pulling to say what's wrong in this area, what's wrong in that area. It's all, going to pieces and whatever. And we don't really see that what place we're coming from and how much we're suffering in the moment. So we need to almost start here, and bring a kind of tenderness and softness to that area where we feel whatever we feel, that isn't settled or um, is not calm, because even just a few moments of calm we could have can level out some, you know, huge ups and downs that are going on in our lives and then in the world. So more time for just being quiet within ourselves. That's not selfish. That's wise. Like you say, that
Yeah,
development.
yeah. So now I think my question is forming a little bit more. Um, in that you're encouraging individuals to turn into their heart more and to bring compassion. Is it a form of self-compassion?
Yep.
Yeah,
And then take the next step.
yeah. And as you were saying that, a phrase from or a statement from Carl Jung popped into my head,
Mm.
and I think it was in an interview shortly after the Second World War. Jung was asked what he thought the future of humanity looked like, given atomic weapons are now accessible. And he said something to the effect that the future of humanity depends on the individual's ability to hold the oppositions within themselves, the opposites within themselves,
Yeah.
the light and the shadow. And Buddhism speaks to this in terms of the defilements of the heart,
Mm.
greed, hatred, delusion being the big ones that
Mm.
you've mentioned. And my sense in terms of a self development, like a psychological self development, is that in my practice, another way of saying this is the thing that I hate the most in the world.
Mm.
The thing that I hate the most in the world, I have seen in my heart now,
Oh, yeah.
and that when that happened, when I started to see that,
Mm.
I know I couldn't blame the other, whoever the other was,
Mm.
with the same kind of vehemence, the same kind of tribalistic passion. I think like I could see I don't like what they're doing. I don't like what they're saying. I don't like how they're talking, but I can see how the factor of, call it the shadow of their being, or the devil within their own heart,
Mm.
is the condition that's operative in their being right now, and that's
Right.
why they're behaving in a way that I find so difficult.
Mm.
But it's something about having seen it in myself and been horrified at what I see in myself
Mm.
has brought about an ability to actually have a lot more compassion for
Right.
myself and for others. And so it's sort of this, I'm giving a personal reflection to, I think, the teaching you just gave.
Yes. Well, if more people would understand that in themselves, then, this would be a better world, just as you were expressing. And that requires, turning towards oneself. like you have been doing, and really allowing those levels to be known. And that then from there, those natural steps are taken, like you just described. But like I said, usually it's pulled out there, and what's wrong about everything out there, which kind of you talked about. But going here, and then when we realize, oh yeah, this same kind of hatred is within this heart and mind, then we tend to have more understanding and more compassion about how it is when we see a person on the news that is expressing something, and we understand, oh, that's hard. That's hard to, the hardest thing to have compassion for is ignorance. It's easier to have, in a way, it's easy because you see, aversion or the harm that's done. That's there. You see the when people are just holding on to their resources and not share, and you see that. That's easier to see, that tightness, that tension, that suffering that there. Or when people are just ignoring what's going on, or just thinking all about themselves, and it's hard to open up to that kind of suffering. The suffering of delusion, the suffering of ignorance.
Can you give an example of that? Like,
I'm thinking quickly of having an example that isn't political.
Well, no, I can. Well, it can be political in a gentle way. And I mentioned I had moved to Maine a few years ago, and to you, and I'm in a different I'm out of the political bubble of urban Boston that I was in, which was a very democratic bubble, and I'm more in a purple phase now, area of living. And when I go out and walk, sometimes I'll meet a neighbor, and we're pleasant, we're friendly, and I'm trying to connect, and but I'm a little bit wary about. I don't know where people's politics are, and things are so fraught in terms of the political divide now. It is scary, or it instills anxiety in me. And there's a phrase that I've heard a few times when I just try to innocently talk about the weather. Like, say something like, well, that was a lot of rain we just got. And they'll say, well, the climate's been changing for a long time. And that's like a whistle. Like they're signaling, okay, we deny climate change in a sense. So this is what I assume. And suddenly I'm like, so I freeze up. I start, and I don't know how to engage. I don't know what to say at that point, other than sort of have a nice day and keep well and move on.
Yeah.
But I see, you mentioned ignorance. This is a form of willful ignorance of science that is
right.
Really hard thing. It's a hard force, a hard condition in our society, given what we're facing and what's coming.
That part's so obvious these days. Yeah. Well, I had a similar situation. I was down at the ocean and walking the beach, and I met a couple that Steve and I always meet. They seem to come down at the same time we do, and started talking about the trails in the sky. That those are trails to. There's something about those trails that people are. There's something wrong about them, that they're just kind of doing something to our atmosphere that isn't right. And then another person comes along and says, I'm really concerned about these, that everything burned down in Lahaina, and now the rich people are going to take over, and this whole, all those theories that go around. And I just listened to them both, and I just said, look, I respect what point of view you have, and I respect what point of view you have. And I just want to say that I came here to hear the ocean. So I'm going to, with a lot of respect for both of, and I really truly just took what they said and in my heart, it was like, that's the way they think.
Mm-hmm.
That's the way certain people, certain things come together, and they think a certain way. And some people I have more patience around, but some people I don't. So I do find ways to kind of receive it, make room for it, and then, just that isn't my world right now. I feel fine to do that.
Mm-hmm.
I deserve to have a walk on the beach.
Yeah, enjoy
that.
the sound
Yeah.
of the ocean.
So people have their conditions. Conditions are rolling on. That's what we can say. People right in front of us. Conditions are rolling on.
So just to stay on this though for a moment, it's almost like you're in both our situations that I feel like we're talking about taking a walk, or we're out in the world, and someone comes across our path that has maybe a view that is challenging to us, or we feel that the view is a kind of a fragmented view that is harmful in some ways. How does your heart generate compassion, or how does compassion in your heart respond to, say, the ignorance or the greed or the aversion that is being voiced in front of you?
Yeah. Well, in that moment, I could say what I just described, and is I open to how it was for those people. So that's the first part. And compassion doesn't have to be a lovey-dovey feeling. It's just that my heart opened to that. Well, that's the way it is for that person. So here I want to say that what empowers compassion is equanimity. Is the equanimity to not be for or against things, but to see this is how it is for this person, or these conditions that have come together. So I truly felt, and my heart got a little bit rankled, I must say, about like, I really just want to walk on the beach, but when I really stood there and listened, and so I could say that was a compassionate act, that my heart opened to. Now the equanimity part is, this is the way it is for you right now. And this is the way it is for this connection right now. So my heart wasn't so reactive. The opposite of equanimity is reactivity. So I could sense it wasn't reactive. And when it's like that, compassion has a better chance when it's not reactive, not working for or against.
So since you're mentioning reactivity, and I know we've been talking for quite a while, but I'll phrase this as the last maybe question for you, if that's okay. Do you still have a minute?
Sure.
I sent you the obituary about Jack Engler in Tricycle, and one of the things that was mentioned in the obituary was some studies that he did. I don't know exactly the nature of the study. I think it involved Rorschach tests and other things, but there was a conclusion he came to from some of his studies with working with advanced meditators like Deepening and her students, and I think students in the West too, advanced meditators, and compared them to, say, beginner meditators. And the salient takeaway was that with advanced meditators, the difference between them and the beginners wasn't that there was no diminution or no diminishment of inner conflict with with advanced meditators, but there was with the advanced group, there was a ability to acknowledge the inner conflict, or there was less denial about the inner conflict. And
that's right.
And given the nature of given the condition of how reactive the world is right now, and to me it feels exceptionally reactive, particularly fueled by things like technology and social media and all the algorithms that kind of fuel tribalistic reactivity. I was feeling into what you said about equanimity as being, was it a proximate cause or a sort of a support to compassion? In the way
Support.
A support, yeah. And I guess Do you have any closing advice for practitioners who find that with practice they're still aware of a lot of inner conflict and inner reactivity, like me,
Yeah.
and to what, other than just, trying to be as mindful as possible or to be as compassionate as oneself, but any words of wisdom or practice advice for the reactivity
Yeah.
that's alive in so many people's minds and hearts right now?
Yes. So, so this brings me to that equanimity practice, which is said to be the most powerful of all the four Brahma Viharas, or those beautiful states of mind like metta, compassion, equanimity, uh, and happiness for the happiness of another. And that is, I want to make sure that I'm describing equanimity fully. And that is, it's not the reactivity. The opposite of equanimity is the reactivity with either greed, hatred, or delusion.
The opposite.
But the opposite of it. But that doesn't mean that there isn't wisdom, or, what can arise when there's the opposite, when there's not the opposite of those things, when there isn't holding on or pushing away or bashing. It's more like the mind sees clearly what's going on. It does see things like, this is how it is right now. And there's um, a sense of being able to see what's going on without one of the defilements, that kind of, when U Pandita used to ask me, what color glasses are you wearing today? Like, what am I seeing through? Asking if there's any defilements. So when there's no defilements, there's a chance for more wisdom to arise, so that, okay, we can chill out a little bit. We can say, okay, I understand your perspective, and I'm going to take a walk on the beach right now. Something, that we don't have to have that inner response of like, you're nice on the outside, but you're seething on the inside. Um, so having equanimity about what's going on within ourselves, just as we need to have compassion about what's going on within ourselves, that if that can accompany mindfulness, then it makes mindfulness more powerful. So when you bring mindfulness to that place, like, gosh, you see that place where we get all tripped up, and then we're still on to, oh, I'm getting tripped up about this out there. Well, can we leave that alone and come here and say, what's going on in here? Can I bring some measure to it of like the tenderness, like loving kindness, or just open to that, to whatever is there with compassion? That means it's not neutral, it's a lot of dukkha. Or just to say, yeah, okay, I accept with that balance, this is the way it is in here. Whenever we can use one of those and pick from one of those, it's really, really helpful to assist our mindful awareness. Then, so that's what I could say in closing.
Yeah,
And I'm trying my best.
that was great. I will say, so the Brahma Viharas, just to summarize, reflect back what you just said, the Brahma Viharas in a way are not optional survival capacities for 21st century right now.
They're essential.
They're
Yeah,
essential, not optional, essential.
Yes. And have them accompany our mindful awareness. Have them be nearby, like bring it in if it's too hard to be aware of that moment. Bring one of those in, and then we can do better in the world. I used to catch Munindra on some things, a little story about Munindra. Like one time I was trying to make an Indian dinner for him and it didn't turn out right, and I, of course, so I see his face go, or whatever he does, And so I said, Munindra-ji, I said, are you upset? And he said, yes, upsetness is there, but I am not upset. He's saying there's no I in there getting identified with it. And sometimes a similar question like that, where I would catch him on something, and he'd say, my path is not yet finished. And I like that. because for a lot of things going on in the world and in my relationship to the world, my path is not yet finished. That's true for me.
I think it's true.
So,
It's. I like the way you're phrasing that, and it's because the conditions of the world are continually changing, and the way we are going to integrate and heal or bring about
yeah,
something generative in the world is going to be an ongoing, unfinished project, I think, for sure.
I agree.
And I just want to thank you so much. It has been great connecting with you. I loved hearing every Munindra-ji gem that you brought to the conversation. I really appreciate your responses to my questions, and it brought back for me how wonderful it was to practice with you on retreat at IMS several times, and particularly around equanimity and compassion. If I would say, of all the teachers I've worked with, when I sat with you, Kamala, both you and Steve, I felt a kind of faith that you embodied in the Dharma that it's hard to put in words, but witnessing the faith that you have in it was just a real beautiful experience to witness. So thank
I'm
you.
glad for you.
Yeah.
You're welcome. I'm glad for you. Yes. So may your practice continue, and like they say in Burma, may you reach Nibbana in the shortest possible time, but don't have any. The American part of it is, but don't get attached. Don't strive too hard for that.
And that's the fine balance I'm definitely still wrestling with, but I appreciate the encouragement for sure. Thanks so
Yeah.
much. Hang
You're
tight for 1
welcome.
second.
Okay, yes.